The moment the scissors sliced through her hair, Sylvia heard the sound of her own rebirth. Not a heartbeat, not a sigh, but the noise of 1,000 strands breaking, like all the humble love from a past life finally severed in one clean cut. In the salon, she looked at herself in the mirror, short hair sharp and neat, brows and eyes fierce, nothing like the girl who had kept her hair long for Julian for 4 years. "Just like this," Sylvia said, a curve lifting the corner of her lips. The phone lit up, Julian's message resting on the screen. 6 o'clock, the usual place. The usual place. It was the Japanese restaurant where they had their fixed Wednesday date. She remembered every corner of that place, remembered how he always ordered the salmon belly she didn't like, remembered how she always smiled and said, "I like it too." This time, she replied with 3 words, "Not going." After sending the message, she said one thing to her reflection in the mirror, her voice soft but firm. "Sylvia, in this life, you will never be anyone's stand-in." That year, Sylvia was 22, in the last spring before graduating from university. She had been reborn. She had died on that rainy night at 26, and when she woke up, she found herself back 4 years in the past. Everything from her past life was still vivid in her mind. How had she fallen in love with Julian? In her sophomore year, Julian returned to campus as an outstanding alumnus to give a speech. She sat in the audience, watching the young man on stage, wearing a white shirt with his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, his voice deep and pleasant to the ear. He talked about entrepreneurship, about dreams, and made every girl in the audience blush. After he stepped off the stage, he walked straight toward her. "What's your name?" "Sylvia." He paused for a moment, then smiled, a gentle smile that seemed to carry a meaning she couldn't quite grasp at the time. "Sylvia, a beautiful name." Then came the romance everyone envied. Julian was a rising star in the business world, young, successful, cool and refined, yet tender only with her. He walked her home, bought her breakfast, and stayed by her bedside when she was sick. She thought that was love. For it, she changed everything. He didn't like her short hair, so she let it grow down to her waist. He preferred girls with a classic, elegant air, so she got rid of all her jeans and sneakers and switched to long skirts and flat shoes. He said the rock music she used to love was too noisy, so she deleted every playlist from her phone and started listening to piano pieces instead. She had remade herself into the person Julian wanted. Until that day. It was the 8th month after their engagement when she received the diagnosis of terminal stomach cancer at the hospital. Standing by the window of the ward, she saw Julian making a call at the end of the hallway, his voice echoing distinctly through the empty corridor. "She really does resemble you," he said softly. "Vivian, when are you coming back?" Vivian. That name pierced her heart like a needle. Later, she learned that Vivian was Julian's childhood sweetheart, the daughter of his foster parents, the one he had loved since he was 15. On the day Vivian went abroad to study, he cried at the airport for an entire hour. And she, merely because she bore a 3/10 resemblance to Vivian, and had her personality deliberately cultivated to become more and more like Vivian, ultimately became Vivian's substitute. She died on the hospital bed. Her last sight was the ward door being pushed open, Julian standing at the entrance, his face deathly pale. She wanted to say something, but she no longer had the strength. She heard his voice, roaring like a wounded beast. "Sylvia! Sylvia, wake up!" She wanted to say, "Stop shouting, are you calling out for Sylvia, or for that Vivian who can never come back?" Then she woke up. Woke up in the barber's chair, the date on her phone showing March 15, 2023, her last semester of senior year. There was still time for everything. Julian's call came in. Sylvia stared at the name Julian bouncing on the screen and didn't answer. The phone rang 4 times, then stopped. It rang again, then stopped. When it rang a 3rd time, she picked up. "Sylvia?" His voice was tinged with confusion. "What do you mean by that message? Are you not coming to tonight's date?" "I just don't want to go." Sylvia's tone was calm. "Julian, let's break up. There was 3 seconds of silence on the other end of the line. What did you say? I said, let's break up. Sylvia looked at her short-haired self in the mirror. I'm tired. I don't want to keep this up anymore. Sylvia, what's going on? Did I say something that upset you? If so, I apologize. No. Sylvia cut him off. I'm not making a scene. I'm serious. Let's break up, Julian. She hung up, turned off her phone, paid for the haircut, and walked out of the shop. The March wind brushed against her face. She took a deep breath and felt as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She walked across the campus, and everyone around her looked at her with surprise. The old Sylvia, long hair, white dress, soft-spoken, with a smile as gentle as a porcelain doll. The new Sylvia, short hair, black leather jacket, jeans, canvas shoes, earbuds in her ears, playing Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. Sylvia. Someone was calling her. She turned and saw Vivian standing by the roadside, holding a cup of milk tea, her face wearing that standard, gentle smile. Vivian was back. Yes, she remembered. In her past life, Vivian had returned at this exact time, finishing her studies abroad and coming back to develop her career in China. And in that past life, she herself was still foolishly trying to please Julian, completely unaware that she was nothing more than a substitute. Sylvia, you got a haircut? Vivian walked over, her eyes scanning Sylvia from head to toe. It's so short. Aren't you afraid Julian won't like it? He seems to prefer girls with long hair. Sylvia looked at her and suddenly smiled. This smile was different from the gentleness on Vivian's face, it carried something Vivian couldn't quite read. What's it got to do with him? Vivian's smile froze for a moment. My hair, I like it, and that's all that matters. Sylvia stuffed her earbuds back in. Vivian, aren't you supposed to be abroad? Why are you back? I graduated and came back to develop my career here. Vivian's smile returned. Julian said he'd treat me to dinner, a welcome-back meal. Want to join? No thanks, Sylvia said. You two enjoy your meal. I won't intrude. She turned and walked away, her steps light, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Behind her, Vivian watched her retreating figure, her smile slowly fading away. Sylvia returned to the dorm. Her roommate Chloe was in the middle of a game and nearly fell off her chair when she saw Sylvia push the door open. Holy shit. Sylvia? Chloe took off her headphones, staring at her with wide eyes. Where's your hair? Cut it off. Sylvia tossed her bag onto the bed. Also, Julian and I broke up. Chloe's mouth formed an O shape. She froze for 3 seconds, then slammed the table. Are you serious? Serious. Why? Chloe jumped up. Julian. That's Julian. The Julian every girl in school wants to marry. Are you out of your mind? Sylvia leaned against the bed frame, watching Chloe. In her past life, this was the only friend who cried the hardest after her death. She had distanced herself from everyone, including Chloe, for Julian's sake, but Chloe had never given up on her. Chloe, she said, if I told you that when I'm with Julian, he's not looking at me, he's looking at someone else, do you think I should still go on? Chloe froze. He has someone else? It's not someone else, Sylvia said. It's a certain shadow I never knew existed. I don't want to be a shadow anymore. Chloe was silent for a long time, then finally said one sentence. Fine, if you want to break up, break up. I've got your back. Sylvia smiled, her eyes a little warm. In her past life, when she died, her biggest regret was not cherishing Chloe as a friend. In this life, she wouldn't make the same mistake again. On the first day after the breakup, Julian called 15 times. Sylvia didn't answer a single one. He sent a message, Sylvia, calm down. Let's talk about this face to face. Sylvia glanced at it but didn't reply. The next morning, Julian came directly to the school. He wore a dark gray coat, his figure tall and elegant, drawing frequent glances from passing girls. He looked up at the window of Sylvia's dormitory, his brow slightly furrowed, the air around him heavy and low. When Sylvia walked out of the dormitory building, Julian's gaze immediately locked onto her. Then he noticed her shortened hair. His brow furrowed even tighter. Sylvia. Julian. Sylvia stood on the steps, meeting his gaze. Julian stepped forward and reached out to touch her hair, but Sylvia turned her head away. Why did you cut your hair? His voice was low, laced with obvious displeasure. You know I prefer you with long hair. Sylvia looked at him and suddenly found it quite amusing. In her past life, hearing those words would have made her apologize profusely, grow her hair out with extra care, and spend an entire day overjoyed at a single "you look nice today." Now she just felt exhausted. Julian, I told you, we're broken up. Whether I cut my hair or not has nothing to do with you. Julian's fingers froze midair. He looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion, bewilderment, and emotions he hadn't yet had time to identify. 2 days, he withdrew his hand, his voice low. You say we're done, just like that, with no reason, no meeting me, no replying to my messages. Sylvia, what's going on with you? A reason? Sylvia thought for a moment. Fine, I'll give you a reason. She looked into Julian's eyes and spoke each word deliberately. Because being with you exhausts me. I don't like wearing dresses, I don't like listening to piano music, I don't like eating Japanese food, and I don't like that every time you look at me, there's no me in your eyes. Julian's expression shifted. What do you mean, there's no you in my eyes? Sylvia didn't answer. She just smiled, a smile that held something Julian couldn't read, something between relief and sorrow. Vivian is back, she said. Julian's pupils contracted sharply. Aren't you going to eat? Go ahead. Sylvia zipped up her jacket. Don't keep your first love waiting too long. She turned and walked away without looking back. Behind her, Julian stood still, watching her receding figure, suddenly feeling something slipping away inside him, too fast to grasp. Vivian. Did he know what Sylvia meant by that? No, he didn't. He wasn't even sure if Sylvia really knew anything. But he had to admit, when Sylvia uttered the name Vivian, his heart skipped a beat. It was the panic of having a secret exposed. Sylvia had changed. That was what everyone was saying. In just 1 week, she seemed like a different person. She no longer wore those soft, gentle dresses, her wardrobe was now filled with hoodies, jeans, and combat boots. She had dyed her hair, a deep brown with a few streaks of blue that caught the eye especially under the sunlight. She joined the school's rock band, picked up a guitar, and began playing and singing the songs she had always loved. No one knew she could play the guitar so well, because in her previous life, for Julian's sake, she had locked away her guitar and effects pedals in the storage room. She also started boxing again. There was a gym near the school, and she went every afternoon, putting on her gloves and unleashing her frustrations on the punching bag. Sweat mixed with tears as she shattered all the grievances of her past life. You've gone crazy? Chloe stared wide-eyed at the boxing video Sylvia had sent her. Sylvia, when did you become such a beast? I've always been a beast. Sylvia panted. I just pretended to be well-behaved for a long time. And Julian, he was experiencing a feeling he had never known before. Every day, he opened Sylvia's social media account to check her latest updates. Her video of playing guitar, her photos at the boxing gym, the group selfie of her eating hot pot with friends, in every single picture, she was smiling. But that smile was different from before. It wasn't the cautious, gentle kind, it was bold, carefree, with a hint of wildness. That wasn't like Vivian. Not at all. That was what unsettled him the most. The old Sylvia was quiet, gentle, and sensible, like a white camellia. He liked her that way, because that version of her resembled Vivian, the Vivian he had loved since childhood but could never have. But now, Sylvia had cut her hair short, played the electric guitar, practiced boxing, and showed her canine teeth when she smiled. This Sylvia was like herself. A Sylvia he had never truly known. It was a strange feeling. He thought he had only treated Sylvia as a shadow of Vivian, but now that the shadow no longer resembled Vivian, he found himself thinking of Sylvia more and more often. When she was still around, he thought she was dispensable. When she was about to leave, he realized that the name Sylvia in his heart was etched deeper than he had imagined. He sent a message to Sylvia, "Can we talk?" Sylvia replied quickly, "There's nothing to talk about." He stared at the line of text, his thumb hovering over the screen, unable to press down for a long time. His phone rang. It was Vivian calling. "Julian, are you free this weekend? I'll take you to an art exhibition." Julian hesitated for a moment, then said yes. He had no reason to refuse. Vivian was the person he had liked for over a decade, and she had finally returned, earlier than expected. He should be happy. But after hanging up the phone, he scrolled back to Sylvia's updates. The latest one was posted an hour ago, featuring a picture of a red electric guitar with only 2 words as the caption, "Rebirth." Julian stared at those 2 words, and his heart clenched sharply. At the weekend art exhibition, Julian showed up. He stood at the entrance of the gallery in a black coat, with Vivian beside him, draped in an off-white lawn dress, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, her smile gentle and warm. The 2 of them standing together looked like a painting. Vivian held his arm, softly recounting the stories behind the paintings. Julian listened, nodding occasionally, but his mind had drifted elsewhere. Then he saw Sylvia. Sylvia stood in another corner of the gallery, with a guy. She wore a black leather jacket and combat boots, and the blue streaks in her short hair caught the light, standing out vividly. She was laughing, a loud, unladylike laugh, yet so genuine it was hard to look away. And the guy beside her, Julian knew him. Lucas. A senior from the School of Design, 2 years ahead of him. After graduating, he founded his own independent design studio and was a legend on campus. Lucas slightly lowered his head, looking seriously at something on Sylvia's phone, and smiled. The profile of his face was gentle and focused. Sylvia stood on tiptoe, leaning in to whisper something to him. The 2 of them stood very close. Julian's face instantly darkened. Vivian felt the stiffness in his arm and followed his gaze, spotting Sylvia and Lucas. "Isn't that Sylvia?" Vivian's voice was gentle, but a flicker of something gleamed in her eyes. "Who's that guy next to her? They seem really close." Julian didn't answer. He saw Lucas take the coffee cup from Sylvia's hand and take a natural sip. Sylvia didn't object, just laughed and gave him a playful tap. That gesture was too intimate. So intimate that it snapped his rationality for a moment. Julian strode over, and Vivian, startled, quickly followed. "Sylvia." Sylvia looked up, saw Julian, and the smile on her face faded slightly, but quickly returned to that calm, none of my business expression. "Julian." She greeted him with no extra expression. Julian's gaze fell on Lucas, his voice icy. "What are you doing here?" Lucas looked at him, neither servile nor overbearing, looking at the art exhibition. Julian turned to Sylvia and said, "I need to talk to you." "I have nothing to say to you." Sylvia's tone was flat. "Go see your art exhibition, and my senior and I will see ours. Let's not bother each other." At that moment, Vivian stepped forward, a proper smile on her face. "Sylvia, Julian was just worried about you. Don't be like this." Sylvia glanced at her and smiled. "Vivian, can you stop speaking to me with that expression every time? As if the whole world is bullying you." Vivian's smile froze. "Are you so concerned about what's going on between Julian and me?" Sylvia tilted her head. "Why don't you talk to him on my behalf?" "Sylvia, that's not what I meant." Vivian's eyes reddened. "I just think you 2 finally got together." "Finally?" Sylvia laughed. "You think it was hard for Julian and me to get together?" Because of how much effort I put into becoming someone else? She paused, looking into Julian's eyes. I don't want to be someone else anymore, Julian. Julian opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but his throat felt blocked. Sylvia didn't look at him again. She turned to Lucas and said, Senior, let's go. Lucas nodded, took the sketchbook from her hand, and the two left the exhibition hall side by side. Julian stood still, watching their retreating figures, his fingers clenching and then relaxing. Beside him, Vivian held his arm, her voice soft and aggrieved. Julian, did Sylvia misunderstand something? The way she looked at me just now was terrifying. Julian said nothing. His mind was filled with Sylvia's last words, I don't want to be someone else anymore. Did she know something? That night, Julian sat alone on the balcony of his apartment, phone in hand, the screen showing Sylvia's chat window. He wanted to send something, but couldn't type a single word. His phone buzzed, a message from Vivian, Julian, did you make it home? Don't take today's events too seriously. Sylvia was probably just in a bad mood. Julian stared at the message and suddenly felt something was off. Vivian was always like this, always speaking from a place of being good for him, always gentle, always considerate, but every word she said seemed to imply that Sylvia was the problem. He remembered the look in Sylvia's eyes when she had glanced at Vivian earlier. It wasn't hatred, nor resentment, it was understanding. Like someone who already knew the ending, watching a play they had seen before. This feeling unsettled him, but he couldn't pinpoint where the unease came from. After the art exhibition, Sylvia's social circle changed completely. She stopped attending parties that required dresses, stopped maintaining connections in the socialite circle, and poured all her time and energy into three things: the band, boxing, and her graduation project. Her relationship with Lucas was also heating up quickly. Lucas was 2 years ahead of her and now ran his own design studio. He was the quiet type, not much for words, but every word he spoke was sincere. Getting to know Lucas was simple. That day, Sylvia was practicing guitar in the school's music room when Lucas pushed the door open looking for something. He heard the piece she was playing and stood there for a long time. Nirvana's Come As You Are, he said. Not bad. Sylvia looked up and saw a guy in a gray hoodie leaning against the doorframe, holding a sketchbook in his hand. You can tell? I used to play in a band in college, Lucas said, walking over and pointing at her fingering. But you could change the way you press here, it'll save you a lot of effort. Sylvia tried it as he suggested, and sure enough, it felt much smoother. Thank you, Senior. You're welcome, Lucas said with a smile. Your guitar is just like you, being itself. Sylvia was taken aback. After that day, they started making plans to practice guitar, visit exhibitions, and have meals together. Lucas was the first person she had met since her rebirth who made her feel at ease. He didn't comment on her clothes, tell her how she should be, or ask about her and Julian. He simply said every time they met, "You look great today." It wasn't "you look beautiful today," nor "you're dressed nicely today," but rather "you look good today." For Sylvia, that was enough. On the other side, Julian's condition was growing increasingly unstable. He began to frequently appear wherever Sylvia might be, the school's music room, the cafe she often visited, the street across from the boxing gym. He knew how ridiculous his behavior was, but he couldn't control it. Every time he saw Sylvia with Lucas, his heart felt as if something were gripping it, aching so much he could barely breathe. Vivian asked him out for dinner, and he turned her down 3 times. When Vivian called, he always said he was busy. Julian, do you not want to see me? Vivian's voice carried a hint of grievance. No, there's just a lot going on at the company lately. Is it because of Sylvia? Julian fell silent. Julian, Vivian's voice softened, you weren't like this before. You used to reply to my messages right away, take the initiative to ask me out, and surprise me on my birthday. Now, you've changed. Julian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Vivian was right. He had changed. But the one who changed Was it really him, or just his feelings? He began to doubt something. All these years he had liked Vivian. Was it truly because he liked Vivian, or because he liked the version of himself that liked Vivian? And after Sylvia left, he realized that some things, once lost, make you understand that you had long grown accustomed to their presence. Accustomed to her being by his side, accustomed to her gentle smile, accustomed to having someone waiting for him no matter how late he came home. That person no longer waits. He wasn't even sure if that person had ever waited for him, whether the one she was waiting for was the real Julian, or the unreachable shadow in Julian's heart. That was a question he dared not ask. The conflict erupted a week later. It was the school's art festival, and Sylvia's band was scheduled to perform on stage. As she walked into the auditorium with her guitar on her back, she noticed a note stuck to her instrument case. It bore only a single line: "A stand-in is just a stand-in, changing the costume doesn't change the past." Sylvia looked at the note and let out a faint smile. Too childish. She took a photo with her phone, then tore up the note and threw it into the trash. Before going on stage, she sent a message to Chloe: "Keep an eye on the backstage for me. Someone touched my stuff." Chloe replied instantly, "Who? Tell me who?" Sylvia didn't reply. She walked onto the stage as the lights came down, revealing a sea of dark figures in the audience. She spotted Julian, sitting in the middle of the third row, with Vivian beside him. She also saw Lucas, standing near the control booth at the side of the stage, holding a cup of coffee. He gave her a nod. Sylvia took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. "Next song, I Will Survive." She struck the first chord, and the moment her voice rang out, every spotlight converged on her. With short hair, a black leather jacket, and an electric guitar, she stood on stage like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Julian, watching from the crowd, felt his heart clench as if someone had dealt it a heavy blow. This wasn't his Sylvia. Or rather, this had always been Sylvia, just a side of her he had never seen. Beside him, Vivian stared at Sylvia on stage, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't like Sylvia, not from the very first meeting. It wasn't because of anything Sylvia had done, but because of the way Julian looked at her. That gaze was too gentle. So gentle that Vivian found it dazzling. She had thought Sylvia was just a stand-in, a shadow of herself. But this shadow was becoming less and less like her, while Julian's look at Sylvia grew more and more earnest. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Vivian lowered her eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corner of her lips. It didn't matter. She had a way out. A few days later, a post appeared on the campus forum. The headline was sensational: "Digging into school beauty Sylvia, cheating, gold digging, being the other woman, is there anything you won't do?" The post was illustrated with pictures, claiming that she was seducing Lucas while still with Julian. It said she cut her hair and wore leather jackets to attract some rich second-generation playboy. It also included several pieces of evidence, all carefully cropped and photoshopped. The post quickly trended on the hot search, and the entire campus buzzed with gossip. Sylvia's counselor called her in for a talk, telling her to be mindful of appearances. Some band members hesitated, wondering whether to quit. People even pointed fingers at her on the street. "See that? Her. Looks all proper, but turns out. I heard she was someone's mistress too." But the rumors lasted less than 2 days before someone noticed. The post was deleted. Not by Sylvia. Someone had reported it. Sylvia didn't know who had reported it, but she didn't care. Because before that, she had already saved all the screenshots, screen recordings, and web page snapshots. Chloe was furious, slamming the desk in the dormitory. "Who did it? I'll check the IP. I'll go find someone from the school's tech department." Chloe. Sylvia pressed her shoulder. "Don't get worked up. I've already saved all the evidence. Can you ask someone from the tech department if they can find out the poster's information?" Chloe froze for a moment. "Aren't you angry?" "Anger," Sylvia said. But anger is useless. What matters is evidence. Chloe looked at Sylvia and suddenly felt she had changed. Not into a different person, but into a better version of herself. All right, I'll go right now. An hour later, Sylvia went to the police station. She filed a report. Cyber defamation, rumor-mongering, personal attacks. She handed over all the evidence to the police, including a photo of the note stuck on the instrument case, as well as all the screenshots from the past few days. According to the law, reposting more than 500 times constitutes defamation, Sylvia said to the police officer. This post has over 30,000 views and more than 1,500 reposts. I request that a case be filed. The officer glanced at her and took the materials. The evidence is solid. We'll investigate as soon as possible. When she walked out of the police station, Sylvia saw Lucas standing at the entrance, holding a cup of hot cocoa. Skip the coffee, you still need to sleep tonight. He handed her the hot cocoa. Everything taken care of? Sylvia took the cup. What are you doing here? Chloe told me. She has a big mouth. Lucas smiled, then looked at her seriously. Sylvia, no matter what you do, I've got your back. Sylvia looked at him, and a certain place in her heart suddenly softened. After being reborn, she thought she had already learned not to trust anyone anymore. But Lucas and Chloe made her feel less alone. 3 days later, the police traced the poster's IP address and identified the suspect. It was Vivian. Sylvia received the news while hitting a punching bag at the gym. She took off her gloves, looked at the notification on her phone screen, and calmly wiped away her sweat. She wasn't surprised. Because her past life had taught her that Vivian was never as gentle as she appeared on the surface. It was just that she had died too soon in her previous life to see it all clearly. When the police knocked on the door of Vivian's apartment, her face still wore that gentle smile. But when she saw Sylvia standing behind the officers, the smile shattered like porcelain. Sylvia? Her voice rose a notch, no longer its usual softness. You called the police? You spread rumors, I call the police, only natural. Sylvia leaned against the doorframe, her tone calm. Vivian's face went pale. She looked past Sylvia. Julian had arrived at some point, standing at the other end of the hallway, his face a mask of disbelief. It was Chloe who called him over. Chloe said, let that man see with his own eyes what his first love really is. The moment Vivian saw Julian, tears immediately streamed down her face, her voice turning pitiful and aggrieved. Julian, I really didn't, someone must be framing me. You know me, how could I possibly do something like this? Julian said nothing. He just stood at the end of the hallway, looking at Vivian as if she were a stranger. The police found the posting records on Vivian's computer, the original photos that had been photoshopped, and her search history, how to hide an IP address and standards for filing defamation charges. Every piece of evidence pointed to her. Vivian was taken away. As she passed through the corridor, she kept looking back at Julian, crying out, Julian, you have to believe me. Her tear-streaked face drew the attention of everyone in the hallway. But Julian didn't move. He stood there, his face ashen, like a statue. Sylvia found the scene deeply ironic. In her past life, she had died without ever knowing what Vivian had done. Now she knew, but she no longer cared. She turned to leave, but Julian suddenly called out to her. Sylvia. She stopped walking, not turning back. When did you find out? Know what? That Vivian, Julian's voice was a little hoarse. Sylvia was silent for a second. Julian, there are some things you don't need to know the answer to. She was gone. Julian stood in the empty hallway, feeling that something had shattered completely. It wasn't the image of Vivian in his heart, but his understanding of his own past. He had always believed Vivian was that gentle, kind girl, his first love, the one he had pined for over a decade without success. But the Vivian he saw today was full of lies and deep scheming. Suddenly, he wondered, had he ever loved the real Vivian, or just the Vivian of his imagination? There was no answer to that question. And Sylvia, he recalled the way she stood at the entrance of the police station, her neat short hair, her calm gaze, like a drawn blade. This was the real Sylvia. And he, in nearly 4 years, had never truly seen her. No. Not 4 years. He had missed her in his past life too. Vivian was lawfully detained for 7 days. When the news reached the school, those who had once reposted the threads quietly deleted their posts. The counselor called Sylvia, her tone much more polite. None of the band members mentioned quitting again. Sylvia didn't take the chance to make any sort of victory declaration. She simply updated a social media post that night. A photo of her at the boxing gym, wearing red gloves, her forehead covered in sweat, but her eyes shining like stars. The caption was just one line, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." When Julian saw this post, he was sitting on the bench in the corridor where Vivian had been taken away. He hadn't left, just sat there for a long time. He thought of many things. He remembered the first time he saw Sylvia, the way she smiled from the audience, with 2 shallow dimples. He remembered how she drank through business dinners just to keep him company, her stomach aching so badly that cold sweat broke out on her forehead, yet she still smiled and said, "I'm fine." He remembered asking her, "What do you like about me?" and she said, "I like the way you are when you're quiet," so she truly became quieter and quieter. He remembered the last time she smiled at him and said, "Good night," then closed the door. He had never asked her what she liked. Never. On the phone screen, Sylvia's boxing photo was still glowing. Julian stared at the picture and suddenly felt a tightness in his throat. He wanted to say so much to her. He wanted to say he was sorry, that he was wrong, that. He picked up his phone, typed a long message, deleted it, typed again, and deleted it again. Finally, he sent a single line, "Sylvia, I'm sorry." The message went through, but a red exclamation mark appeared in front of it. "You have been blocked by the user." Julian stared at that exclamation mark for a long, long time. He put down his phone, tilted his head back, and looked up at the light on the corridor ceiling. The glare was so harsh it made his eyes sting. 7 days later, Vivian was released. Julian didn't go to pick her up. It was Vivian who called him first, her voice hoarse, sobbing uncontrollably. "Julian, I'm really sorry. I just lost my head for a moment. I like you too much. When I saw you with Sylvia, I couldn't control myself. Can you forgive me, please?" Julian held the phone, silent for a long time. "Vivian," he finally spoke, his voice very calm, "I won't come to pick you up anymore." The crying on the other end of the phone paused for a moment. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You spread rumors, you slandered someone, you tried to ruin a girl's reputation. If Sylvia hadn't kept evidence, if the police hadn't investigated quickly, what would her situation at school be like now?" But she wasn't actually hurt, Vivian's voice turned shrill. "The post has been taken down, hasn't it? The one being detained now is me, not Sylvia." Julian closed his eyes. "Vivian, let's not contact each other anymore." "Why? Because of Sylvia?" "Not because of her," Julian said. "It's because of what you did. And also because I finally figured something out." "What kind of thing?" "The one I've always liked was never you." The other end of the line fell completely silent. "The person I love is the you in my imagination," Julian said softly. "And that you never existed." He hung up the phone. Later, he heard that Vivian's parents had sent her abroad, to a city far away. She never reached out to him again. 3 months later, Sylvia graduated. On graduation day, she wore her cap and gown and took countless photos on the field with her band friends. Chloe hugged her and cried, cursing her for being heartless and abandoning her after graduation. "I'll come find you." Sylvia ruffled Chloe's hair. "You can't shake me off." Lucas stood among the crowd, camera in hand, and said to her, "Sylvia, look this way." Sylvia turned her head, and the camera captured the moment she smiled. She looked at that photo later and realized she was smiling genuinely, with a light in her eyes, a light she had never possessed, not in this life nor the one before. She hugged her guitar and sang one last song at the graduation party. It was Nirvana's Something in the Way, which she had rearranged into a brighter version. As she sang the last line, she saw Julian standing at the far end of the playground, watching her from across a crowd of 100 people. He had lost a lot of weight, the line of his jaw sharper than before. He stood at the edge of the crowd, utterly still, watching her like a tree forgotten in a corner. Sylvia's eyes met his for a second. Then she turned away and stepped off the stage. Lucas was waiting for her off stage, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. "These are for you." "Why sunflowers?" "Because your smile is like them," Lucas said. Facing the light, leaning on no one. Sylvia took the flowers, lowered her head to smell them, and smiled. "Senior, do you like me?" Lucas looked at her, neither denying nor admitting it, and simply said one thing. "Sylvia, what I like is the way you are now, the true you from beginning to end." Sylvia looked at him, her eyes a little hot, but she held back. She didn't say yes, nor did she say no. She simply said, "Senior, take it slow." Lucas smiled and nodded, saying okay. Not far away, Julian stood still, watching Sylvia take the flowers from Lucas's hand, watching her smile, watching her and Lucas disappear into the crowd side by side. He didn't chase after her. It wasn't that he didn't want to, it was that he didn't dare. He remembered the words Sylvia had said, "I don't want to be anyone's substitute." Now he understood. She wasn't talking about a substitute for Vivian. She was talking about a substitute for the fictional Sylvia he had created in his heart. He had always thought he wanted a gentle, obedient, understanding girl who would revolve around him forever. But it was only after Sylvia left that he realized what he truly wanted had always been just Sylvia. A Sylvia who would laugh, cry, get angry, resist, box, and play the guitar. A Sylvia he could see not with his eyes, but only with his heart. But he had seen it too late. He stood in the corner of the playground, watching the sunset stretch Sylvia's shadow long and long. She walked farther and farther away, until she was beyond his reach. Sylvia walked along the tree-lined path on campus, the sunflowers in her arms in full bloom. She suddenly remembered something. When she was very young, around 7 or 8 years old, she had met a boy in an art class. That boy didn't like to talk, always sitting alone in the corner drawing, and the other kids wouldn't play with him. Only she would go over, sit beside him, and draw with him. She drew a sunflower, crooked and uneven, but done with great care. The boy looked at her and spoke for the first time. "Why are you drawing a sunflower?" "Because it can grow well on its own without relying on anyone else," the little girl said with a smile. "It is its own light." That day after school, the boy handed her a drawing. It depicted a girl standing in a sea of sunflowers, her eyes curved into a smile. Later, they lost touch, and the drawing was nowhere to be found. But Sylvia now remembered the boy's name. His name was Lucas. Sylvia stopped in her tracks and looked back. Julian was no longer on the playground. She turned her head and continued walking forward. Behind her, the window of the dormitory building where she once lived was still open, the wind stirring the bedsheet that hadn't been taken in yet, like someone waving goodbye. Sylvia did not look back again. In this life, she would no longer be anyone's substitute. She was Sylvia. She was simply Sylvia.